Hi, I'm John Paul and a really warm welcome back to my channel. Today I'm delighted to have another subscriber's question to look at, and this question is about training to be a therapist and the effect that it's going to have on relationships potentially. In this case, this person's talking about romantic relationships, but they then go on to talk about the effect on all and any close relationships. So as I say, I think it's a great question. Inevitably going into training as a therapist, as is going into therapy actually, is going to have an effect on relationship with self and relationships with others to a greater or lesser degree. So thinking about that now and going into it with the eyes open, I think is a very helpful thing to do. So very helpful question, I think very interesting question. So what I'm going to do is I'll read the question out and then I will provide some sort of reflections. Of course, I don't know the person in detail or their circumstances, so it's not specific advice about what somebody should do within their relationship, but I do think there are things that we can generally look at here about the training, about the effects that is likely to have and how we might therefore respond to those. Just before I go ahead and read the question out, I just wanted to let you know that my course, my personal development course, Life Unlimited, 10 Steps to Real Change, is now available on the homepage of this YouTube channel. I've made it available for free, so please do take a look. It consists of 11 videos, just over half an hour long each. It's a journey really, going through the 10 steps that are written about in my book, Finding a Balanced Connection as well. 11 videos, around 6 hours in total, going through all different areas: thoughts, feelings, body, behaviors, relationships with others, looking at communication, boundaries. So recorded videos of me talking, and there's kind of visual aid. And then beneath the videos, I will be putting up copies of the documents that are referred to there, kind of looking at values, beliefs. They're not up there at the moment, but I will do that. If you do it, please let me know what you think about it. That would be great. You can comment below the videos or contact me separately. Of course, if you like it, and also with this video too, please do give the video a like, do share it with anybody else who you think might find it helpful. And by the way, if you haven't subscribed to the channel already, as I often say, then please do that. That would be great, and you'll be notified of other videos coming up in the future. As I say, this is a subscriber's question too, so if you have any other questions, I really like replying to them and hearing what people have to say. So do send them in, either can respond below videos on the YouTube channel or separately contact me via my email address, via the website, and those details are on the YouTube page as well. Also, these are just my thoughts and reflections about the issue. I'd love to hear what you think, anything that you'd like to add, anything perhaps you disagree with, what your experience of this particular issue has been. And again, please do feel free to comment below the video about that. I try and reply to everything that's put up by people, or also, as I say, separately email me about it. So let's go to the question itself. I'm just going to read it out, and then, as I say, we'll run through some reflections on it. I'm currently going through training to become a therapist. They're very early on with it. They're a little concerned that once they're super aware of their relationships and their personality, that they're going to try and change their wife, i.e. give advice to or push onto her their ideas about her personality traits. And they'd obviously like to leave their personal relationship alone. That's what they say. They'd like to leave their personal relationship alone. They then go on to say, how do you navigate seeing traits in someone close to you that you dislike or don't align with? Firstly, when the person says, I'd like to leave my personal relationship alone, the thing about that I would say is that I don't think that's going to be possible. You know, in my experience, what happens with going through the training, and it's quite deliberate that that the training turns attention a lot to our own internal landscape and how our boundaries and our imagination and our attachment styles and all those types of things. I mean, inevitably, when we're learning about these general concepts, we will be applying them to ourselves. That going through that is going to shift things internally in relationship with self, and that's what needs to happen often. And of course, will shift things therefore in relationships with other people as well. So I don't think it's going to be possible, is the first thing to say. That's just in my experience, to separate relationships outside of, I guess, the therapeutic relationships from the kind of changes that will most likely happen whilst training to be a therapist. I mean, I will go on to say that, of course, the whole premise of therapy and making the kind of changes that come through therapy itself, but also through the training, is that those ought to be helpful things from the point of view of relationship with self and relationships with others. Largely, it may, of course, be, and it's always the potential and often the reality for people that does mean over time that actually some relationships might come to an end. But I will come on to that point. But just going back to this sort of leaving personal relationships alone, or being able to kind of protect or separate off or compartmentalize certain relationships from the kind of changes that happen inevitably whilst going through a process like this, as I say, I think it will be something that will most likely happen. You know, when we shift how we see ourselves, whether that's kind of an increase in self-esteem, a more grounded sense of our worth and value, that kind of thing, that will absolutely have a knock-on effect on everything around us. A few other things to say there. You know, I have mentioned the importance, from my point of view, of if we're going to be able to establish and maintain good therapeutic relationships with clients, then we can't be full of what's happening as far as our own material in life. I mean, that's life. We're human. Things happen. We will go into the room having just experienced whatever with people outside of the room. Sometimes that's going to feel good and we're going to go in a state that you might say is regulated. Other times those things are going to be dysregulating. But more things that are dysregulating externally, and if you're looking at a romantic relationship, for example, which might have real problems within it, and if that's consistently dysregulating for us, that will have an impact on our client work. So I think it's important from that point of view, but just for our own happiness and contentment generally, but from the point of view of the client work as well, that if there are things within relationship where we aren't getting needs and wants met, things are difficult, dysregulating, annoying, frustrating, we're not feeling alive, whatever it might be, I think it is important that we put some attention on to those things potentially changing. The other thing, of course, if we're sitting with people and we're talking with clients and we're talking about how they might advocate more for themselves in relationship, you know, their communication, their boundaries, whether they're getting their needs met, I think it's often going to be very difficult to be talking like that with others and kind of suggesting things and working with them there if we're doing something very different externally. So a lot of what clients will be bringing is about relationships with others. Of course, you know, it's either about relationship with self largely or others. So often advocating for themselves and getting their needs met more, and as I say, putting boundaries in, kinds of things they'll be talking about. I think it will be difficult to be sitting with clients doing that if we're not sort of walking the walk in relationships outside of the therapy room. Just looking at some of the specific wording that the person has written here, I think it's very important, some of the things that they say, and I completely agree with them when they say they don't want to try and change their wife or push ideas onto her. So I think, you know, change will inevitably happen if we're in contact in those sorts of dynamics with other people. But in trying to change another person, I think is going to be problematic, and it doesn't work anyway. We can't change another person. What we can do is change what we do in relationship, how we communicate. Maybe we'd even say less. Sometimes it would say more. It depends what somebody's journey is. But if we change, even in how we see ourselves, our relationship with ourselves, I think that inevitably has a knock-on effect on any relationships, particularly those that are very close to us as well, because we're spending a lot of time around those people. So I'd completely agree with the person here that not trying to change another person is not going to and it won't work. And also because it's not possible, I don't think. But also they'll go on to say as well, they don't want to push ideas onto someone. And again, I think that's very important, isn't it? It very much could be the case if you're going through the training and all the kind of things that we learn, you know, about anxiety, depression, narcissism, the personality disorders potentially, you know, there's a psychiatric component learning about that during the training. There are all kinds of ideas that we learn about self and others and human beings that if we are minded to be, or in a place of, say, criticizing somebody else consistently, we can very much get a huge amount of material to go home and do that with. So I really can see why it's something that we ought to be very mindful of, because of course if we do that, nobody ever changed, no relationships ever changed by criticizing somebody. By the way, again, I'm not specifically commenting on what this person has said. They haven't used the word criticism there. I'm just talking generally in relationships. If we're looking at, how changes might be made, how people do things differently, it isn't often through being criticized by other people. It's not through, say, my ideas being pushed onto another person, because that's usually disconnecting for somebody. I think here what can be important to hold in mind, isn't it, that both within therapy and also training to be a therapist, actually what a lot of what's happening is about facilitating change being made within somebody and therefore within their relationships. And we don't do that. We're never encouraged to do that as therapists by criticizing somebody or by forcing a frame on them. What we do is things like unconditional positive regard, which is really the opposite of that, I suppose. We experience being able to, I guess, facilitate those conditions which are going to establish and maintain therapeutic relationships which facilitate change. And it's not about pushing a frame on somebody. It's not about consistently pointing out what the problems might be in them. So I think also if this person, which I think, as I say, I think is a very real and understandable concern, is concerned that what the course might do is encourage them to do that a lot with the partner, to criticize, to learn something here and then take it home and say, well, you don't do this, you're deficient, there's a flaw, there's a lack there. Again, I don't think that that's what a lot of the training will be encouraging. A lot of the training, I think, in my experience, encourages really, firstly, looking inwards and mapping our own internal landscape as our own attachment styles, inner masculine, inner feminine, our needs, wants, how we connect to our own emotions, our relationship with our own body. Inevitably, it's always going to be going hand in hand with relationships with others, isn't it? Those two can't be separated. But I think there's a lot about the training which will help with facilitating change both in ourselves and then on the relationship, actually. If you're looking at communication, the kinds of things, again, this is all in my experience, the ways in which we would be kind of learning to communicate to another about our needs and wants is not generally with things like you words or calling somebody names or criticizing them. It is to acknowledge our emotions, our experience, and then to communicate them where necessary, where we choose to, in a way that's most likely to get our need met, which is by expressing it in kind of I words, very much owning it. So all these kind of things, I think, come through the training very much, again, all my experience, which actually facilitate, make it much easier to deliver to another person if we do have a difficulty with something that they're doing, and therefore in that case much more likely to get our need met of this change happening. I think it's very important to acknowledge that if you're looking at relationships in life, that where would be most difficult to change, it would be within romantic relationships, probably parental relationships, because they're mostly the ones that are most unconscious. So that we're doing things based on old patterns. So from that point of view, really to acknowledge here that this person's concerned that there are things that are going to come up and that it's probably going to be difficult to change. It might be more difficult to change, as I say, than it would in relation to, say, a relatively new friendship, or if you develop a friendship on the course with another therapist, it may be much more difficult to say the things that we want and need to say or to advocate for ourselves, depending on our past, with a romantic partner than it would be somebody new that we've just met, who we know is much more likely to be receptive to it or curious about it, for example. Because it may be that what this person's noticing in their partner, which is why they're kind of internally it's being flagged, is that their partner might have a difficulty with challenge, their partner might have a difficulty with change, their partner might perceive saying, well, I'd like this to be different, as a personal criticism, and get defensive and get angry and disconnect. So again, look, I'm not providing any detailed advice on this person's situation because I'm not aware of it, but maybe that we are conscious that that's might happen. And I will talk about that again towards the end, the kind of options of accept it, change it, or leave it here. So I think it's important to bear in mind here, this idea, and I have talked about it in other videos, that I think being in therapy and also training to be a therapist, it establishes much more that principle, I think, of not looking away from things, not denying the reality of it, not trying to sweep things under the carpet. Equally, we don't want to be jumping on something, in rage or anger with somebody and consistently criticizing them, because that's not going to change either. But there is a way, I think, that comes through therapy for people, but also often through the training as well, that will facilitate that change much more easily, I think. This expectation effect that I mentioned in a previous video as well, I'll put a link to that above here. It will come up either there or there, I'm not sure. But this idea, as I say, of the expectation effect, that if we believe something is going to not go well, then that's much more likely to manifest. Look, this isn't a manifestation or secret thing, but I think if you apply it to here, if what I believe is when I raise something with my romantic partner, for example, about what I may have a difficulty with, if what I believe is that that's potentially going to be catastrophic for the relationship, that's much more likely to happen. I think that's true, that I would go into the situation feeling much more nervous, therefore much more likely to perhaps get annoyed myself. And those kind of things become, unfortunately, a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think an expectation, which for me is based on working with people over the years, is that what we kind of learn to do during the training is facilitate change in relationship with self and others, which is going to be beneficial and helpful for someone. And I think to have that expectation, I think, is important. I remember personally somebody saying to me, this wasn't within a therapy situation, but with a friend outside, where there was a dispute that we had, I guess that you might say a rupture, and they said to me, we will talk about this for as long as it takes for you to feel okay about it again. We talk about it for hours if that's what you want. That was the first time anybody had ever in my life said that to me, actually. But you can see from this point of view that from an expectation point of view, the expectation that set up was that it was going to be okay, whatever happened. And I guess that okay might have meant that I would see less of them, or it may mean that we work our way through communicating to a place where there is repair. And with that expectation that we would, I think it's much more likely to happen. And I do realise it's not as simple as that. And particularly, as I said, if you're talking about romantic relationships, parental relationships, they are the ones where people get most triggered, where there's most early material, most wounding. You might say most of the trauma that people experience has come from those places. So it's not as easy as just holding in mind that this is all going to be okay. And also, of course, going through the training process, there's a whole process. If we're going to communicate something to others and look at change in self and relationships with others, we need to know what those alternatives are in terms of communication behaviors, and that's potentially a long process. For some people, that takes as long as it takes. It may not be finished, or unlikely to be finished, if it even is ever finished, during therapy training. But what I do think here is it is a very real thing that the things that we do and learn to do during therapy training are actually going to improve, most likely, relationships with self and others. Subject, of course, to the quite significant caveat is that sometimes it's just not going to work out with someone. Again, want to make it very clear, I'm not talking specifically about the question that this person's raised in terms of the specifics of them with their partner, but they do go on to say, how do you navigate seeing traits in someone close to you that you dislike or don't align with? The thing that I would say there, and I have talked about it in other videos, I'm going to put links to them here, the videos that I put up about red flags in relationship. I think there are three alternatives for us. It's just the way I would look at it generally in these kind of situations. We accept it, we change it, or we leave it. Just going through those quite quickly because I talk about them in more detail in those other videos. So please do take a look if you have the time as well. But as I say, just looking at those quite quickly in relation to this, if you're looking at accepting it, specifically accepting something in this situation, perhaps with a romantic partner, which you realize during therapy training or even therapy, because you'll be having therapy training during therapy as well, but is quite something that's quite significant for you, perhaps in terms of the extent to which somebody loves you and what that looks and sounds like, attunement, empathy, that kind of thing. If that's what's being identified, I think there are some things that are much more difficult to accept than others, because romantic relationships are primarily about loving and being loved, aren't they? Most of us would say that. So if part of that is very compromised in somebody, if there is a real deficit and lack, of course, it's because of biological, environmental reasons for them, everybody's doing their best, then I think accepting that is going to be much more difficult than it would be to accept, for example, someone who you see every 2 months for 3 hours doing that. In that case, They might, for example, never ask you a question and very much be looking at their own experience of things all the time. That's much more easy to tolerate than I think if that was your partner who you're living with day by day. I think acceptance generally probably will get more difficult if it's something that's painful, annoying, something that leaves you flat. I think that will get more difficult over time, in my experience, during the training and with more therapy, because of course one of the things that therapy training is doing, and also therapy itself often for people, is to connect them a bit more with their emotional experience. It's not the case with everybody, but lots of times what's happened for people, and the reason why they may feel lost or whatever it might be, is that their connection with the messages that come from their emotional experience, that's been disconnected over time, because that's what was necessary to survive, perhaps even thrive in particular environments. So if you're looking at the therapy training, an amount of that is going to be reconnecting self with emotional experience, lifting up emotional experience to equal importance with people's thoughts, lifting up my emotional experience with equal importance with another person's emotional experience. A lot of people get into the familiar routine with parents in some ways of orbiting around them. I'm happy if you're happy, and we get used to that. So it's not necessarily that we're not paying attention to emotions at all. It might just be that we just focus on if they're happy, as I say, I'm happy. And again, I think during therapy training, my own experience, because of mapping the internal landscape, the attention that's going to self inwards, what are my responses to things when I start seeing clients? How did I respond? What was that like? What did I think? And of course, talking about the clients themselves and their experience too. But that really does, for me, in my experience, that really lifted up the importance of what's happening for me internally. And that makes things much more difficult to ignore, because when you listen to your body more, when you listen to your emotions more, they get louder. You can't unsee something, you can't unfeel something when these kind of shifts happen. But of course, what people are going to tolerate, people have different levels of tolerances, different levels of sensitivities. We're all different. I would say here that I wouldn't want for somebody, certainly for myself, that sort of acceptance and tolerance of something because of a wound, or because I don't believe that I deserve something different. I'm living, with the familiar, something which has been problematic in the past. So if it's conscious and consciously chosen to tolerate, to accept, then that's everybody's prerogative, isn't it? So acceptance is one thing. Looking at the second one, change. If I don't want to accept it, change happening. Again, not going to say that much about it here. I talk about it a lot in the book. I talk about it. There's something specifically about change in the course, Life Unlimited, as well. But often, some basic principles around that, I think, is the change is not to change another person, which goes back to the person who's asked the question, what they say about, I don't want to try and change her. Well, we can't. But if I change within myself, if I change how I see myself, my self-esteem, if I change how I communicate, how I advocate for my feelings, then that will inevitably change how the relationship goes. I don't even necessarily have to explicitly communicate things, I don't think, to another person. I mean, it will often need to be the case if it's a romantic partner, of course, because of the amount of material and things that need to be worked through. But even a shift internally in how I see myself, some people might say, well, my romantic partner takes me for granted. My romantic partner doesn't acknowledge my felt experience of things or invalidates it. In order to have been with that person for a long period of time, I probably, to some degree, it's not a fault thing or a blame thing, but have somehow accepted that or colluded with it or tolerated it. But even to feel it differently, even to feel differently in life about ourselves and about who we are and our worth and value, I think that changes relationships. People experience us differently as well if we're experiencing ourselves differently. Sometimes though, we might advocate for the change, talk about it, and it's never going to change. About change, willingness or ability for people, I don't believe that people are unable to change. if we do communicate, this need and want and say how we would like it to be different, because that's often the case, is that criticism doesn't come with an preferred alternative. So one of the things that will hopefully be happening during therapy or training to be a therapist is we're also coming up with what might be different and how it might be different for us, what might be our preferred alternative. But we may offer all these things, consistently do that, keep regulated, keep communicating, and somebody just doesn't do it differently. Is that an inability or unwillingness? I suppose I'm in a profession which is based on the premise that everybody can. So it's not an inability on the human being's part to not change. Maybe there are, though. Maybe there are sort of structural reasons why people can't. But I would tend much more towards it being an unwillingness, actually, on someone else's part. That initially, of course, the reason they don't respond to it is something isn't present, but we all learn new things during life. We've all done that. So I would be looking for the willingness in somebody else to make the changes that are necessary in order to make this relationship go better. That's what a relationship is, isn't it? It's a constantly kind of evolving backwards and forwards mutuality between two people. But if somebody is unwilling to do that for us, if we've given it time, we've communicated, it doesn't percolate through, there isn't any sort of consistent change, then our choice, of course, is, and I'm not saying these words as if it's an easy thing, but our choice would be potentially to leave. But just wanted to look at the options, I suppose, as I say, if we're going back to the question and them saying about, what do you do if you see traits in another person that you just don't align with? Okay. Lots of ideas there. I'd love to hear, as ever, what you think about it, all your views about what I've said, whether you agree with it, things you disagree with, anything, of course, that you would like to add. Please do comment below the video, or you can do that separately. That's absolutely fine. As I've said at the beginning of the video, please ask any more questions that you would like to ask, and I will try to respond to them. Please do like the video if it's been helpful. Share it if you think anybody else would find it interesting. And please do just subscribe if you haven't already. Lots of videos coming up, so I shall see you again soon, and do take care in the meantime.